Hello everyone. Today I'm going to walk you through Chapter 44, Gifted Education in Rural Schools by Nicholas Colangelo. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. And this presentation is by Joshua and I. First, we're going to talk about what is the definition of rural. The federal definition that we see in the reading is residual category of places outside urbanized areas in open country or in communities with less than 2,500 inhabitants. Many people tend to see rural areas to be very country or agricultural focused areas. And then the operational definition is it reports the use of the term non-metropolitan in reference to these areas. And they describe that as any place that falls out of metro areas. So you see that throughout the reading a lot, that they describe like urban areas as metro and then rural areas as non-metropolitan. And I was very interested to read these readings because I come from an area that they would, under these definitions, categorize as rural. So it was very interesting for me to see what the author had to say about gifted education in those areas. So that is a general definition of just when we talk about rural schools, what are we talking about? Here you can see a graph of the number of rural students per state. The ones in the bold are the top 20 rural states. You can see at the top. So those are just showing the number of students per state. You can see it says at the bottom it's the percentage of public school students in small town rural areas. Georgia falls right in the middle with about 48% of its students being in a small town or rural area. The next slide is we're going to kind of first talk about rural schools in general, and then we're going to dive into gifted education in those areas. So just a kind of overview of rural school demographics and economics. Every state in the United States has rural schools except the area of Washington, D.C. Rural populations have been shrinking since the last century, so only 1/4 of the population in the U.S. today live in rural or non-metropolitan areas. Rural populations continue to age, and most of these areas depend on a single industry at a time. A lack of economic diversity. So like, for example, there might be like one big factory that is in that area that a lot of people move there for that. And however, schools may be seen as focal points of activities and a centerpiece of the communities. It talks about in the reading how kind of back in the day they used to be in rural areas just places like of gathering for communities. And like even today we see like voting and things happening in schools in rural areas. This is kind of a look at rural education in general, not necessarily gifted education, but just an overview of rural education. Rural areas are home to 50% of public schools and 39% of all public school students in the U.S. So 39 of all the students in the U.S. go to a rural public school. So some strengths that we're going to talk about later too, but some of the strengths that you see compared to other schools that they might call like metropolitan, you have smaller class sizes, lower dropout rates, community support, teacher autonomy, and plenty of various opportunities for students to participate in school activities. So these things are talked about a lot throughout the presentation in relation to the education as a whole and gifted education. A huge thing for them is community and the opportunities that are in the communities. We see on page 572 of the reading a quote that says, "The literature on gifted education in rural schools is as sparse as rural population." We also hear that studies and things on gifted education in rural areas is very sparse. Also, their work in higher education in the work world are linked to the climate of their community. So a lot that happens and a lot that is taught in rural areas has to do with the world, with the work available in their community. So like I know in the small town that I'm from, we have a very good like vocational school at our high school, because a lot of students take the route of going to like a technical college or even just working right out of high school because of the job opportunities within our community. They don't necessarily need them to go to college. In schools, again, it says that schools have always been important places for small towns, that they are a focal point of activity. Some issues that we see in rural education today: rural students do not earn college degrees at the same rate as their metropolitan peers, and that kind of has to do with what I was just saying on the previous slide. A lot of times the workforce within small towns don't necessarily need college degrees to work in them. So a lot of times, in order to support their family or themselves, a lot of students in these schools go to work right out of high school. Therefore, they don't earn college degrees. However, due to low financial support and size of student body, it makes it hard for gifted programs to exist. So it talks about a lot throughout the reading as well, that with the lack of student body, it's kind of hard to make groups of gifted students sometimes. Another quote from the reading says, gifted students from rural schools perceived less challenge, interest, and generally less enjoyment in classes compared to their urban and suburban peers. Another issue is rural schools sometimes lack the resources, accessibility, exposure, and because of the location. So, for example, like the town I'm in, I went on a lot of the same field trips just to things in the town because there isn't that many things. And like to go to Atlanta was like an hour and a half, and sometimes there's not enough time in the day, and things like that. So a lot of times opportunities are not had because of the lack of resources available. That also, lack of resources and accessibility can also go with like exposure. It talks about in the reading exposure to different occupations and things like that. In small towns, you don't have as large a variety to things like that. It's also a lack of focus from voters and citizens on education issues. During economic hardship, students may be taken out of school in order to help the family. I also kind of touched on that earlier, that sometimes students have to drop out to go to work in order, and that's kind of why you see a lower completion of college degrees or even high school diplomas. And highly educated individuals, skilled workers, will be more likely to leave these areas upon finishing school. So people who do go on to earn college degrees in higher education don't usually return to these areas. So it's kind of the same pool and population of people that stay in the area. And then consolidation of schools is a huge issue in rural areas, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. So consolidation of schools is a very big issue. And this kind of means like putting schools into one, taking two schools to make another bigger school. There's a trend right now for building bigger and better schools by combining them. There is evidence that shows that smaller schools have dropout rates. They have lower dropout rates. So there's a lot in the reading about how we're still doing these things, like we're consolidating schools, even though there's evidence against it. So there is a smaller dropout rate in smaller schools. Socioeconomically disadvantaged students perform better in smaller schools, and students' participation is higher in smaller schools. So again, studies show a lot of damage is done when a community loses a school. Closings are there because of requirements of the school building authority, and they're ironically happening at the same time that urban districts are looking for ways to create smaller schools. So they talk about in the reading schools within schools to try to get that smaller school feeling in urban areas. But even though we're closing down and consolidating schools in small towns, this actually happened in the town that I am from. They consolidated to elementary schools, and we only have one middle school and one high school, so there's no way to consolidate those. But now there are higher, I believe, like teacher to student ratios because of the consolidation. These are some benefits of rural education today. Again, we're still talking just about the overall rural education, not necessarily gifted. A benefit of rural education is that there's a higher level of teacher and student contact. that's a big advantage that's talked about throughout the whole reading, is the relationship that students have with teachers in a rural education setting. There's more individualized learning because of the smaller student teacher ratio. That creates an environment for more individualized learning through community involvement. In a small town, you see a lot of community involvement because they want to be involved in the schools. Greater opportunity and need for students in a small town to participate in things like sports, student government, and clubs. Because there's only one school and there's not that many students in this school, it's very accessible to be a part of all those things. Increased sense of belonging. So when you're a bigger, when there's a smaller whole, you become a bigger piece of that whole. Spontaneous and flexible planning between teachers and that kind of thing. They talked about in the reading just how it was easy for teachers to communicate with each other in smaller schools, which led to more spontaneous and flexible planning based on student needs. And community service opportunities were greater in a smaller town. Some current issues. So now we're going into rural gifted education specifically. There's a huge lack in kind of knowledge and funding when it comes to gifted education. So we see that gifted education has similar experiences in funding and interest, and hard to define, just like rural education. Gifted education is seen as more elitist because of pilfering resources to specific areas. So it talks about that a lot, about how in this small town, the gifted education is kind of seen as better as everyone else, and that kind of gives off a bad feeling. There's a little attempt to provide adequate assistance or develop a national network to serve these students. The goal they kept talking about is to advocate educational opportunities for gifted students while preserving the integrity of rural schools. So kind of the issue that it's all focused around is this. They want to figure out how to provide opportunities for gifted students while also keeping the great qualities of a rural school. Another issue is access to technology, lack of programming, lack of peer-based, like I talked about earlier, lack of AP classes, and overemphasis on community college. I definitely see this at my school, my high school, and then the difficulty in hiring teachers who are qualified to teach the gifted students. So these are some issues that we see in relation to gifted education today. Some positives to rural gifted education today. As I discussed earlier, individualized attention. This is a big thing because there is the smaller teacher to student ratio. Teachers are allowed, even though the programs are not necessarily in place for gifted students, teachers are more easily allowed to and able to adapt the curriculum to the students. Opportunities and involvement in a wide range of activities despite skills. So, clubs and things like that, students are able to join them more easily because there's not as much competition to be in those in a smaller school. There's always a large commitment from the community and parents, and they want to be invested in gifted education. A lot of the things on this slide have a lot to do with the same benefits that you see just in the rural education in general. Some other positives or opportunities are available because of community within the school. So even though there's not a lot maybe within the community does a great job of providing opportunities for the students by being involved. And then there's a whole part in the reading from gifted students, and they talk about things that they like about being in a small town, and some of those things are, again, the community involvement. And one guy talked about like getting thank you notes and that kind of thing from the community from a project he did, and it was easy to get involved in the community. And his relationship with teachers, he was able to complete a project because of the relationship he had to teachers and the opportunities that were available to them within the community. So these are some of the positives that they talked about in the reading. And again, that's the end. But again, the whole point of the reading was to see the positives of a rural community and figure out how to amp up a gifted education program while also holding true to the characteristics of a rural population.